I am Adeline, 28 years old, and 2 weeks ago I stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk in the pouring Oregon rain, staring at a glossy real estate sign hammered into my grandmother's front lawn. The word "sold" was printed in bold red letters, a bright, garish contrast against the dreary coastal mist of Astoria. My grandmother Sylvia was the woman who actually raised me. She taught me how to read historic blueprints and mix proper lime mortar, while my own parents preferred the sterile networking events of Portland high society. 14 days ago, she died, holding my hand. Her breathing was a shallow, quiet struggle against the fluid filling her lungs. While I was still waking up at 3 a.m, instinctively reaching for my phone in the dark to check on her, my parents and my older sister sold her 1894 Queen Anne Victorian. They rushed a cash deal with an out-of-state developer, closed the sale behind my back, and split the money 3 ways. I received nothing. My mother called me from her pristine high-rise condo, the ice in her Pinot Noir clinking against the crystal glass through the speaker. "She did not leave you anything, sweetheart," she said. Her tone is casual, as if she were discussing the weekend weather forecast. "The house was a financial liability. We did you a favor by handling the mess." But my parents made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a naive, grieving girl who would walk away empty-handed. They did not know about the final, raspy words my grandmother whispered to me just minutes before her heart monitor went flat. If you have ever been erased by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever had your deepest grief treated like a mere inconvenience, then you know exactly how cold family can be. Welcome to Mourning Revenge. Before I tell you what I found hidden inside the walls of that Victorian, drop your age in the comments and tell me where you are listening from, but only if you are ready to hear how a dynasty built on lies gets dismantled, piece by piece. Let me take you back to our final night. The hospital room smelled of clinical antiseptic and the bitter, stale coffee I had been drinking for 3 days straight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over Sylvia's face. I sat in a hard plastic chair pulled tight against her metal bed railing. Her skin felt like thin parchment paper stretched over fragile bird bones. I held her hand, tracking the slow, agonizing rhythm of the machines, keeping her tethered to this world. There were no tearful goodbyes or poetic speeches. My parents were not there. They claimed the traffic on the interstate corridor was simply too heavy to make the drive down to the coast, choosing the comfort of their home over a final farewell. Sylvia squeezed my fingers. It was a weak grip, but her eyes snapped open with a sudden, piercing focus. "The truth is in the bones of the house, Addie," she whispered, her voice barely a scrape against the plastic oxygen tube resting on her pale lip. Check the laugh. 20 minutes later, the monitors sounded a long, continuous tone, and the only mother I truly knew was gone. The funeral took place under a suffocating slate-gray sky, the Oregon rain drumming a relentless beat against the green canvas canopy stretched over the gravesite. I stood at the edge of the artificial turf, my dark wool coat heavy with dampness, listening to a hired pastor deliver a generic eulogy for a woman he never bothered to meet. A few feet away, my family mourned in their own specific way. My mother, Pamela, adjusted the collar of her designer trench coat, leaning her head toward my father. "If we file the transfer before the quarter ends, we avoid the reassessment penalty," she murmured. Her voice carried no sorrow, only the sharp edge of a transaction. Richard, my father, nodded slowly. He pulled back his tailored cuff to check his gold wristwatch. "I will have the broker draft the paperwork by Tuesday." On my left, my older sister Vanessa shifted her weight from side to side. She sighed, a loud sound meant to signal her profound boredom. "This mud is ruining my Prada heels," she muttered, glaring at the wet earth near the burial plot. Could they not have paved a path for the family? I looked away, my jaw tight, my throat aching with a grief so heavy I could barely swallow. They did not shed a single tear. I kept my hands shoved deep inside my pockets, my fingernails biting into my palms to keep from screaming. That brings me back to this morning. I drove to the Astoria house with a trunk full of folded cardboard boxes, planning to carefully pack away Sylvia's extensive library of architectural history books. I walked up the wooden steps of the wraparound porch, a familiar path I had taken thousands of times since childhood. The smell of cedar and salt air usually brought me peace, but today the air felt thick and wrong. I reached into my jacket pocket for the heavy brass key. Instead of the antique deadbolt, I expected to find a sleek, blinking electronic keypad was mounted to the doorframe. My heart hammered against my ribs. The brass plate had been pried off, leaving splintered wood in its wake. A quick, desperate phone call to the county clerk's office laid out the sterile mechanics of the betrayal. There was no probate court. There was no reading of a last will and testament. 8 months prior, while Sylvia was heavily medicated and declining in a rehabilitation facility after a bad fall, Richard and Pamela had paid her a visit. They brought a stack of standard medical directives, and buried deep within those forms was a durable power of attorney. They used her failing mind to gain total legal control of the estate. By the time the soil settled over her casket, the deed had already been transferred and the title cleared. The out-of-state developer wired the funds and the transaction was sealed. I stood on the porch, the coastal mist clinging to my eyelashes, staring at the flashing red light of the keypad. I was locked out of the only sanctuary I ever had, standing on the outside of my own life. My family saw an old, deteriorating wooden structure and turned it into quick cash to fund their endless appetite for luxury. They thought they had tied up every loose end, but they forgot what I do for a living. They forgot I am a senior architectural conservator. They saw a payday, but they did not understand the architecture, and they certainly did not know what was waiting for me behind the plaster. The drive from the damp, cedar-scented coast to the glittering high-rises of Portland took 2 agonizing hours. The rain lashed against my windshield in blinding sheets, mirroring the relentless pounding of betrayal in my chest. I drove straight from the locked Victorian in Astoria to the Pearl District, where my parents leased a penthouse that looked more like a sterile surgical suite than a home. I rode the mirrored elevator to the top floor, the silence pressing heavily against my eardrums. I pushed open their heavy mahogany double doors without bothering to knock. The air inside smelled of expensive ozone and synthetic citrus diffusers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the gray city skyline, framing white marble countertops and low-profile furniture with sharp metallic edges. It was a space designed exclusively to impress wealthy guests, devoid of any actual warmth or comfort. My mother, Pamela, stood by the sprawling kitchen island, casually pouring a dark, heavy Pinot Noir into a crystal balloon glass. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater, not a single delicate fiber out of place. She seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just buried her mother-in-law mere days ago. My father, Richard, sat on a leather sofa that cost more than my first vehicle, typing briskly away on his sleek silver tablet. Why is there a blinking electronic keypad on Sylvia's front door? My voice was low, steady, and carefully stripped of the raw grief threatening to crush my windpipe. Pamela did not flinch or drop her gaze. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, leaving a faint smudge of berry-colored lipstick on the thin rim. We sold it, Adeline. The closing finalized this morning. She set the glass down with a soft, dismissive clink against the cold marble. She did not leave you anything, sweetheart. The house was a financial liability. We did you a favor by handling the mess. A liability. Sylvia clipped grocery coupons and sewed her own linen curtains. She never carried a balance on her credit cards in her entire 80 years of life. She owned that coastal property free and clear. Richard set his tablet aside on the glass coffee table, removing his reading glasses with a tired, practiced sigh. He looked at me with the patronizing expression he usually reserved for reckless teenagers. You only saw the surface, Adeline. Your grandmother had hidden debts, astronomical medical bills from the rehabilitation center, unpaid property taxes, structural fines from the city council. The estate was drowning in red ink. We had to liquidate immediately just to break even and protect the family name from a messy public foreclosure. The lie was so smooth, so well rehearsed, it made the acid rise in my stomach. This was their specialty. They manufactured an alternate reality, wrapping their deceit in a suffocating blanket of fake parental concern. I knew Sylvia's finances intimately. I helped her balance her physical checkbook every Sunday evening at her scarred wooden kitchen table. There were no hidden debts. There were no structural fines. But pointing that out would only make them pivot seamlessly to another lie. Before I could dismantle Richard's fabricated story, the front door swung wide open. My older sister Vanessa breezed into the foyer, bringing a gust of expensive perfume and rain-damp air. She dropped a heavy leather designer handbag onto the pristine entryway table with a loud thud. Her manicured fingers twirled a keychain, displaying the gleaming silver emblem of a luxury German automaker. "You will never believe the deal I got," Vanessa announced, ignoring the thick, suffocating tension in the room. The dealership tried to tack on a premium for the custom leather interior, but I told them I was walking with my cash. They caved immediately. She tossed the keys onto the counter, the metal striking the marble like a judge slamming a gavel. A brand new $90,000 luxury SUV purchased in straight cash in the exact same week my parents claimed they had to execute a fire sale on my grandmother's home to cover imaginary debts. The math was right there, brazen and unapologetic. Vanessa finally turned her attention to me, her dark eyes sweeping critically over my damp canvas jacket and mud-spattered work boots. "Oh, you are here." She leaned against the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of sparkling water. "Mom told me you were throwing a tantrum about the Astoria place. Honestly, Addie, you need to let it go. You were obsessing over a drafty, rotting pile of old wood. What were you even going to do with it?" Preserve it, I thought bitterly. Honor its history. Live in the rooms where I actually felt loved. But I kept my mouth firmly shut. "You cannot pay rent with sentimental value," Vanessa sneered, taking a delicate sip of her water. "I know you love scraping old paint off historical baseboards for your little conservator projects, but the rest of us live in the real world. We need liquid assets, not termite-infested liabilities. Why do you always have to be so difficult?" The urge to sweep the crystal wine glasses off the marble island surged through my veins, hot and sharp. I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, to tear apart their pristine, fabricated narrative until the ugly reality bled through. But screaming would not win this war. They wanted me to lose my temper. They wanted me to look unstable, emotional, and irrational, so they could easily dismiss my factual accusations. I inhaled a slow, deep breath, tasting the expensive, sterile air of their condo, and forced my racing heart rate to slow down. I needed strategy, not noise. "Enjoy the new car, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone deadly flat. I turned my back on them and walked out the door, the heavy glass shutting firmly behind me, cutting off Pamela's fake sigh of maternal exhaustion. I took the elevator down to the underground parking garage and climbed into the cab of my beat-up truck. The rain drummed against the metal roof, a familiar, steady rhythm, grounding my thoughts. I pulled my laptop from my canvas messenger bag and connected it to my mobile internet hotspot. My hands shook slightly as I navigated to the Clatsop County Public Property Records database. I typed in the address of the Victorian. The search results populated in stark black and white text. The deed transfer was recorded just 3 hours ago. The buyer was a corporate entity, an out-of-state development firm. But it was the finalized sale price that made the breath catch in my throat. They sold a prime piece of historic coastal real estate for less than half its actual market value. It was a panicked cash grab, a desperate rush for untraceable funds. You do not leave hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table unless you are trying to hide the transaction as quickly as possible. My parents thought they had erased my connection to the house. They thought they had secured their stolen payday and left me powerless. But they forgot Sylvia's final, desperate words. Check the laugh. Whatever she hid in the bones of that architecture, it was valuable enough that she waited until her dying breath to tell me, ensuring my parents were nowhere near the hospital room. I opened my phone and pulled up the contact information for the development firm listed on the public deed. I found the name of the managing director, Elias Thorne. As a professional architectural conservator, I adhered to a strict code of ethics. You do not contact private property owners unprompted. You do not interfere with finalized real estate transactions. But those polite rules belong to a world that played fair, and my family had just burned that world to the ground. I opened a new text message, my thumbs hovering over the bright screen in the dark cab of my truck. Mr. Thorne, I typed slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I am a historic preservationist, and your new property in Astoria possesses a critical structural anomaly you need to know about immediately. Let me inside. I pressed send, knowing this single action would tip the first domino in a chain reaction my family could never stop. The drive back to the coast felt entirely different from my frantic departure yesterday. The morning fog rolled off the Columbia River, wrapping the Astoria streets in a thick, damp chill. I parked my battered truck a half block away from my grandmother's Queen Anne Victorian. Through the gray mist, I spotted a silver pickup truck idling in the driveway. A man stood near the wraparound porch, shining a heavy-duty flashlight into the crawlspace vents near the stone foundation. This had to be Elias Thorne. I braced myself for a confrontation with a slick corporate liquidator in a tailored suit, the kind of predator my parents usually associated with. Instead, the man examining the damp earth wore scuffed leather work boots, faded denim, and a yellow rain slicker. He was taking notes on a waterproof clipboard, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. I grabbed my canvas tool bag from the passenger seat. It held my specialized preservation instruments, the tools of my trade. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder, taking a slow breath to steady my racing pulse. I walked up the cracked sidewalk, my boots crunching against the wet pavement. He looked up when he heard my footsteps clicking off his flashlight. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. I stopped a few feet away, projecting a calm, professional authority I did not actually feel. "My name is Adeline Sterling," I said, keeping my posture rigid. "I am a senior architectural conservator specializing in Pacific Northwest coastal heritage properties. I understand you recently finalized the purchase of this estate." Elias crossed his arms, shielding his clipboard from the drizzle. "The deed cleared yesterday," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you with the City Historical Commission?" I shook my head, stepping closer to point at the stone foundation he had been inspecting. "No, but I know this structure better than any municipal inspector. You are looking at the foundational settling near the northeast corner. You probably think it is water damage from a failed gutter system." Elias blinked, clearly caught off guard. He glanced back at the stone wall. The inspector flagged it as potential timber rot in the main load-bearing beam, he admitted. "It is not timber rot," I countered smoothly. "The original builders in 1894 used old-growth Douglas fir, which is practically petrified by now. The structural sag you are seeing is actually due to a degraded subterranean coal chute that collapsed decades ago. If you tear into that beam expecting rot, you will compromise the entire eastern wall and incur a 6-figure repair bill." Elias stared at me, the skepticism in his eyes slowly transforming into genuine intrigue. He lowered his clipboard. "How could you possibly know about a collapsed coal chute?" he asked. "Because I know the bones of this architecture," I replied, holding his gaze. "I need 3 hours inside this house. In exchange, I will give you a comprehensive structural assessment of the entire property, detailing every original material, hidden defect, and load-bearing quirk. It will save your firm tens of thousands of dollars in exploratory demolition." He studied my face, the heavy canvas tool bag slung over my shoulder, and the sheer determination radiating from my stance. He did not know my family had just sold this house out from under me. He only saw a highly qualified professional offering a lucrative exchange of expertise. After a long, tense moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a digital key card. 3 hours, Sterling, he said, tossing the card into my waiting hand. I have meetings at the municipal planning office until noon. I want that assessment on my desk by tomorrow morning. Do not touch the main breaker box. The wiring is fragile. I nodded once, offering a curt expression of gratitude, and walked past him up the wooden porch steps. The electronic keypad chirped a sharp, high-pitched sequence as I swiped the card. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the foyer. The silence inside was immediate and suffocating. The air smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and the faint lingering scent of Sylvia's lavender soap. I stood in the hallway, the emotional weight of the empty rooms pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. The antique Persian rugs were gone. The mahogany entryway table where Sylvia used to leave her reading glasses was missing, leaving a pale rectangular ghost on the hardwood floor. My throat tightened. The urge to sink against the floral wallpaper and weep for the woman who raised me was overwhelming. But I forced the grief down, locking it away in a dark corner of my mind. Crying would not uncover the truth. I had a deadline, and Elias would return soon. I adjusted the strap of my tool bag and walked past the parlor, ignoring the hollow echoes of my own footsteps. I bypassed the main living areas and headed straight for the staircase, my hand trailing lightly over the smooth, curved banister. I climbed to the second floor, then turned toward the narrow, concealed door at the end of the hallway that led to the third-floor attic. The air grew noticeably colder as I ascended the steep, creaking wooden steps. The attic was a sprawling, unfinished space beneath the pitched roof. Exposed wooden rafters angled sharply overhead, draped in thick gray cobwebs. A single dormer window let in a weak shaft of gray daylight, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. I set my bag down on the rough plank floor and pulled out my high-powered flashlight. "Check the lath," Sylvia had whispered. I scanned the perimeter of the room, analyzing the wall structures with a practiced, critical eye. The eastern and western walls were lined with smooth, uniform drywall, the result of a cheap renovation my father had insisted on a decade ago to improve the insulation. I ignored those sections. I knew my grandmother would never trust her secrets to a modern, flimsy renovation. I walked toward the center of the space, shining my beam on the exposed brick of the chimney breast. The walls flanking the chimney had never been updated. They retained their original 1890s construction. I ran my fingertips over the uneven, textured surface of the plaster, feeling the distinct, rigid, horizontal lines of the wooden lath strips hidden just beneath the surface. This was the original skin of the house. I moved slowly, tapping the handle of a steel trowel against the wall, listening to the resonance. Solid, solid, solid. Then, about 3 feet off the floor, tucked into a dark alcove between the brick chimney and a heavy support beam, the sound changed. The tap produced a hollow, dull thud. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt on the dusty floorboards, shining my light directly onto the plaster. There was a faint, nearly imperceptible seam where the plaster had been carefully cut and expertly reapplied. To an untrained eye, it looked like a natural settling crack. To a historic home restorer, it was a deliberate surgical modification. I unzipped my tool bag and retrieved a thin, flexible utility saw, a pry bar, and a heavy pair of leather work gloves. I positioned the serrated edge of the blade against the seam, applying steady, precise pressure. I sawed through the brittle plaster, the gritty white dust raining down onto my boots. I worked methodically, ensuring I did not damage the structural integrity of the surrounding lath. Once the plaster was scored, I wedged the pry bar into the gap and applied a sharp, downward leverage. A rectangular panel of plaster popped free, falling backward into my gloved hand. I set it aside and aimed my flashlight into the dark cavity. The space between the inner and outer walls was packed with dense, coarse horsehair insulation, a common practice in 19th century coastal construction. I reached my hand into the freezing, dusty void, my fingers digging through the scratchy fibers. My knuckles scraped against something hard and unyielding. It was not wood. It was cold metal. I gripped the object and pulled carefully, working it free from the tangled insulation. and was surprisingly heavy. I dragged it out of the wall cavity and set it on the attic floor. My flashlight beam illuminated a rectangular, heavy-gauge tin box. The surface was heavily oxidized, covered in a mottled pattern of dull gray and rust. A sturdy brass padlock secured the front latch. This was it. This was the truth Sylvia had used her dying breath to protect. I stared at the metal container, my mind racing with 100 different calculations. My parents had rushed the sale of this property for a reason. They needed quick, untraceable cash, but they had unknowingly abandoned the very evidence they should have destroyed. I reached out, brushing a layer of decades-old dust off the lid. "Sterling." The sudden booming voice echoed up the narrow stairwell, shattering the quiet of the attic. "Are you up there?" My heart slammed against my ribs, a spike of pure adrenaline flooding my system. It was Elias. He was back early. I glanced at my wristwatch. Only 2 hours had passed. The heavy thud of his boots sounded on the second-floor landing, moving steadily toward the attic door. I had seconds. I grabbed the heavy tin box and shoved it deep into the bottom of my canvas tool bag, hastily piling my trowel, pry bar, and utility saw on top to conceal the rusted metal. I kicked the loose piece of plaster back toward the wall, hiding the dark hole in the lath with my own body, just as Elias appeared at the top of the stairs. "Found anything interesting?" he asked, his eyes scanning the dusty room before landing on me. I stood up, my knees trembling slightly beneath my denim work pants, and hoisted the heavy strap of the bag onto my shoulder. "Just documenting the original chimney flashing," I replied, my voice steady despite the frantic pounding in my ears. I walked toward him, the weight of the hidden box pulling at my shoulder, realizing with a chilling clarity that bypassing the physical barrier of the house was the easy part. Carrying this stolen evidence out the front door meant I was no longer just a grieving granddaughter. I was a threat, and the true danger was only just beginning. The drive south from the coast into the Willamette Valley felt like moving through a long, gray tunnel. The rain battered the windshield of my truck, a relentless rhythm that matched the steady pounding in my temples. I carried the canvas tool bag up 2 flights of wooden stairs to my apartment, the heavy metal hidden inside dragging at my shoulder. My living space was a modest, functional area, smelling faintly of dried sage and drafting graphite. The contrast to my parents' pristine, sterile penthouse in Portland could not have been more striking. I dropped the bag onto my scuffed oak dining table. My hands were stiff, my fingers aching from gripping the steering wheel too tightly for 3 hours. I pushed aside a scattered pile of historic zoning permits, reached into the deep canvas opening, and hoisted the rusted tin box onto the tabletop. The brass padlock securing the front latch was ancient, covered in a thick layer of oxidized green patina. I did not waste time looking for a delicate solution. I walked to my utility closet, bypassing my fine restoration instruments, and retrieved a pair of heavy steel bolt cutters. Positioning the thick metal jaws over the curved brass shackle, I leaned my entire body weight onto the rubberized handles. The antique metal resisted for only a fraction of a second before giving way with a sharp, echoing snap. I tossed the broken lock aside and pried the stiff lid upward. The rusted hinges shrieked in protest, releasing a trapped pocket of dry, stale air that smelled of cedar shavings and aged paper. There were no sentimental trinkets inside. There were no childhood photographs, no pressed flowers, no antique jewelry handed down through generations. The box was packed to the brim with tightly bound financial folios, thick stacks of bank statements, held together by brittle rubber bands, and a single, cracked leather diary. I pulled a wooden chair out from the table and sat down, my pulse throbbing at the base of my throat. I reached for the first stack of bank records, carefully unfolding the stiff, yellowing paper. The documents bore the official, embossed crest of a premier national wealth management firm. The header read, "The Henry Sterling Revocable Living Trust." My late grandfather had established this fund decades ago. He explicitly designed the trust to provide for Sylvia during her lifetime, mandating that the remaining principal be divided in equal thirds upon her death. 1 share for my parents, 1 share for Vanessa, and 1 share for me. It was a substantial estate built patiently over a lifetime of smart timber investments and careful coastal property acquisitions. But as my eyes scanned the columns of withdrawal history, the cold, undeniable mechanics of an expansive financial crime began to materialize. My parents did not just sell the Victorian house to cover imaginary debts. They had been systematically bleeding the primary family trust dry for the past 5 years. I tracked the outbound wire transfers, my fingernail tracing the printed numbers, line by line, across the pages. The amounts were staggering, executed with a brazen disregard for the fiduciary duty my father held as the acting trustee. $45,000 diverted to an offshore holding account just days before my parents purchased their luxury timeshare in Cabo. $80,000 siphoned to cover the initiation fees and annual dues at their exclusive Portland Country Club. And then there were the recurring heavy capital injections directed to an entity called VS Wellness. VS Wellness was Vanessa's vanity project. 2 years ago, she attempted to launch a high-end lifestyle and organic skincare brand. She threw lavish promotional parties, rented an expansive retail space in the Pearl District, and hired expensive marketing consultants. The business imploded within 8 months, filing for bankruptcy and leaving a long trail of unpaid vendors. My parents had told everyone they refused to bail her out, claiming they wanted to teach her a harsh lesson in financial responsibility. The bank statements told a very different story. Richard and Pamela had quietly funneled over $250,000 of Sylvia's money into Vanessa's failing company, burning through my grandmother's security net to fund my sister's delusion of grandeur. They orchestrated a sophisticated embezzlement scheme to sustain a lifestyle they could not actually afford. The house in Astoria was merely the final, desperate liquidation. They drained the liquid cash and then sold the physical real estate to cover their tracks before the trust mandated an official audit upon Sylvia's passing. My stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. I pushed the ledgers aside and picked up the cracked leather diary. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. I opened it to a dog-eared page near the middle, recognizing Sylvia's elegant, sloping, cursive handwriting immediately. The ink was slightly faded, but the words delivered a devastating physical blow to my chest. She knew. My grandmother knew exactly what they were doing. I read the entries, my breath catching in my throat as the sheer terror of her final years jumped off the pages. Sylvia documented every missing withdrawal, every forged signature, every time Richard forced her to sign a blank authorization form under the guise of paying her medical premiums. But it was the entry dated 11 months ago that made the blood freeze in my veins. I asked Richard about the missing funds from the main account. Sylvia had written, her pen pressing so hard into the paper it nearly tore through the page. He became enraged. He stood over me and calmly explained that my memory was failing. He said if I made wild accusations, he would have me declared legally incompetent. He threatened to place me in a state-run psychiatric facility and strip me of all my legal rights. He said no one would believe an old woman losing her mind. A hot, prickling sensation spread across the back of my neck. My father had weaponized her age against her. He terrorized his own mother, trapping her in a state of constant fear within her own home. She was isolated, entirely dependent on the man who was stealing her blind. But Sylvia was a survivor. The subsequent entries revealed a quiet, desperate rebellion. Knowing she lacked the physical strength and legal resources to fight my father in open court, she spent her final months secretly gathering every piece of damning evidence she could find. She photocopied the bank statements at the local library. She requested hard copies of the ledger histories. She sealed them in the tin box and buried them in the one place she knew Richard would never look, the original bones of the house. I knew Addie would find it. The final entry read dated just a week before her fatal fall. She understands how to uncover what has been painted over. She knows how to restore the truth. I closed the leather diary. The overwhelming, suffocating grief that had consumed me since the funeral vanished entirely, burned away by a sudden, terrifying clarity. My parents did not just steal my inheritance. They stole my grandmother's peace of mind. They forced her to die in a state of quiet, agonizing terror, looking over her shoulder in the house she built. I sat in the dim light of my apartment staring at the scattered documents. The urge to weep was gone. In its place, a cold, calculating fury settled deep into my bones, heavy and unyielding like poured concrete. I was no longer a mourning granddaughter. I was an architect, surveying a condemned building, carefully mapping out the load-bearing pillars so I could plant the explosives in the exact right places. They built their entire dynasty on a foundation of elder abuse and financial fraud. I was going to tear it down to the studs. I began gathering the papers, planning to organize them into a chronological timeline for a litigator, when a sharp, insistent knock hammered against my front door. The sound jolted me out of my intense focus. I froze, the bank statement slipping from my fingers. I lived in a secure building. No one came to my apartment unannounced. The knock sounded again, louder this time, 3 rapid strikes against the wood. I stood up silently, sliding the tin box and the ledgers underneath the large architectural blueprints scattered across my dining table. I walked softly to the entryway and pressed my eye against the small glass peephole. Standing in the hallway, shaking the rain from her expensive designer umbrella and glaring at her phone screen, was Vanessa. She had driven 3 hours south from Portland, showing up at my doorstep with zero warning, bringing the very danger I was preparing to fight directly to my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the heavy wooden door inward, just enough to block the direct line of sight into my dining area. Vanessa did not wait for an invitation. She pushed against the frame, forcing me to step backward, and marched confidently into my narrow entryway. She collapsed her dripping designer umbrella, shaking the excess rainwater onto my woven seagrass rug without a single downward glance. She wore a tailored camel coat and knee-high leather riding boots, looking entirely out of place in my functional, modest living space. I closed the door slowly, my pulse drumming a frantic cadence against my ribs. Just 10 feet away, resting, exposed on the oak surface of my dining table, a thin stack of Sylvia's financial ledgers peeked out from beneath a rolled architectural blueprint. If my sister took 4 steps to her left, the entire facade would crumble before I had the legal firepower to back it up. Vanessa wandered into the kitchen, tracing a manicured finger along the edge of my laminate countertop. She sighed dramatically, inspecting her pristine nail polish. The traffic on the interstate was an absolute nightmare, she complained, treating her unannounced arrival as an immense charitable favor. Mom told me you were being incredibly stubborn about the Astoria property, so I figured someone needed to check on you. I wanted to make sure you were not spiraling into some deep depression over a pile of rotting lumber. I stepped between her and the dining area, using my own body as a physical barrier. I offered to make tea, turning my back just long enough to fill the electric kettle. The ceramic mugs clinked together as I set them on the counter. Vanessa leaned against the refrigerator, completely oblivious to the radioactive secrets hidden just a few feet away. She launched into a bitter grievance about her financial portfolio. "You have no idea how stressful this week has been. Adeline," she whined, crossing her arms. "The capital gains taxes on my share of the estate payout are brutal. The government wants to take a massive bite out of everything. My accountant is working overtime just to shield the windfall from the Revenue Service." My hands tightened around the plastic handle of the kettle. She was standing in my kitchen, complaining about the tax bracket on stolen money. I poured the boiling water, watching the dark chamomile leaves swirl in the hot water. I handed her the mug, keeping my facial expression carefully blank. "It must be a terrible burden to manage all that sudden wealth," I replied, my voice a flat, measured monotone. Vanessa missed the dark sarcasm entirely. "It is a nightmare," she agreed eagerly, taking a delicate sip. "And to top it off, Mom and Dad are stressing everyone out with this extravagant anniversary gala they are planning. 35 years of marriage, and they want to celebrate their so-called new chapter by renting out the entire Willamette Country Club. I have to find a custom evening gown by the 14th, which is practically impossible on such short notice." A gala. They were throwing a lavish, catered party using the funds they embezzled from a dying woman. I kept my gaze fixed on the steaming surface of my tea, carefully calculating my next maneuver. I needed to know where the capital was currently sitting. You would think they would want to keep things quiet right now, I suggested softly, tossing out the psychological bait. Given the sudden estate liquidation, flashy parties and big purchases might attract unwanted attention from the tax auditors. Vanessa rolled her eyes, waving her hand in a dismissive gesture that nearly spilled her hot drink. Please, Dad is way too smart for that. He has a wealth manager setting up a corporate entity in the Cayman Islands. They are migrating the bulk of the liquid assets into an offshore holding company by the final Friday of this month. Once the transfer clears, the domestic accounts get closed and the entire nest egg becomes untouchable. Even the state auditors cannot pierce that corporate veil. The oxygen vanished from the room. The final Friday of the month was exactly 18 days away. The timeline had just accelerated from a theoretical problem into a ticking time bomb. If Richard successfully moved that capital across international borders, the money would disappear into a black hole of offshore banking secrecy. The trust would be permanently drained, and recovering the stolen funds would become a jurisdictional nightmare. My father was moving fast, attempting to bury the evidence of his financial crimes under layers of complex international law. Vanessa set her half-empty mug on the counter, checking her reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure you were not doing anything stupid, she said, pulling her camel coat tighter around her waist. You need to accept reality. Stop living in the past. It is not healthy to hold on to things that are gone. I walked her to the entryway, my face a carefully constructed mask of passive acceptance. Thank you for stopping by, I said, opening the door. Have a safe drive back to the city. She stepped out into the hallway, opening her umbrella before she even cleared the threshold. Buy yourself some new clothes for the gala, she tossed over her shoulder. Mom will have a heart attack if you show up looking like a tired construction worker. I locked the deadbolt the second her boots hit the stairwell. I leaned against the solid wood, releasing a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow, leaving my hands trembling and my knees weak. I walked back to the dining area and swept the blueprints onto the floor, exposing the rusted tin box and the damning ledgers. Righteous anger was a comforting emotion, but it was practically useless against international banking maneuvers. I could not fight this battle with righteous indignation. I needed a weapon. I needed a predator. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my professional contacts until I found the number for Harper Quinn. Harper was a ruthless estate litigator I met during a contentious historical preservation dispute 3 years ago. She was pragmatic, aggressive, and possessed a terrifying reputation for dismantling complex corporate trusts with surgical precision. She did not operate on emotion. She operated on leverage. I dialed her direct line. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and impatient. This better be a structural emergency, she answered, the rapid sound of keyboard clicking echoing in the background. It is a financial emergency. I corrected my tone, dropping into a cold, businesslike register. I need to retain your services immediately. My parents have embezzled a substantial trust fund, committed severe elder financial abuse, and are currently attempting to wire the stolen capital to an offshore holding company in 18 days. I have the physical ledgers, original bank statements, and a written confession from the victim. The typing stopped instantly. The silence on the line was heavy and charged with sudden interest. Bring everything to my office in downtown Portland tomorrow morning at 8 sharp, Harper commanded. Do not digitize the files. Keep the originals in a secure lockbox. The following morning, the rain had temporarily ceased, leaving the city skyline sharp and clear against the pale sky. Harper sat behind a massive glass desk in her high-rise corner office, silently reviewing the contents of Sylvia's tin box. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her expression completely unreadable as she cross-referenced the bank transfers with the diary entries. For 45 minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp rustle of old paper and the quiet hum of the climate control system. Harper finally closed the leather diary, leaning back in her ergonomic chair. She folded her hands, studying me with a predatory intensity. "The documentation is ironclad," she stated, her voice devoid of any comforting warmth. "Your father was sloppy. He relied on intimidation rather than clever accounting, assuming your grandmother would die before anyone audited the ledger. We have a definitive case for civil fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and elder abuse." I felt a brief surge of vindictive triumph, but Harper raised a single finger, halting my reaction. "But you need to understand the reality of what happens next," she warned, leaning forward until her forearms rested on the glass desk. "If we file this injunction to freeze the domestic accounts, you are dropping a nuclear bomb on your own family. Your father is a proud, wealthy man. When you corner a narcissist, they do not apologize. They retaliate. He will launch a vicious, scorched earth campaign to destroy your professional reputation, drain your personal savings in retaliatory litigation, and humiliate you publicly. Once I file this paperwork, there is no going back. Are you prepared to burn your family to the ground?" I thought about Sylvia, terrified and alone in her final months, forced to hide her own bank statements inside the walls of her home. I thought about Vanessa standing in my kitchen, complaining about the unfair tax burden on stolen money. I reached across the glass desk and picked up the expensive silver fountain pen resting near the retainer agreement. "Light the match," I said, signing my name with a steady hand. The next 4 days blurred into a grueling, sleep-deprived marathon of forensic accounting. Harper transformed her sleek corner office into a tactical command center, stripping away the polished veneer of corporate law to reveal the gritty mechanics of an investigation. We spent hours pinning enlarged copies of Sylvia's fragile handwritten ledgers to the frosted glass partition walls. We cross-referenced every single ink-stained line item against public property records, corporate tax filings, and vehicle registration databases. The procedural reality of the betrayal unfolded before my eyes in stark, undeniable mathematics. My parents did not merely steal a few $1,000s here and there. They laundered the trust fund through a series of cynical, categorical lies, treating my grandfather's estate like an endless personal treasury. I traced my index finger across a faded entry dated 14 months ago. Sylvia had recorded a $50,000 withdrawal designated by my father as an emergency medical expense for her physical rehabilitation. Harper typed the corresponding transaction date into her dual monitor setup, hacking through the digital trail to pull up Vanessa's vehicle registration data. The timestamp matched the initial down payment on my sister's brand new luxury SUV down to the exact afternoon. A few lines further down the ledger page, a substantial $100,000 drain was logged under structural home repair. Harper cross-checked the bank routing numbers against international real estate registries. The funds were wired directly to a premier resort conglomerate in Cabo San Lucas. It purchased the exact oceanfront timeshare my father boasted about during last year's holiday dinner. The theft was grounded in modern financial reality, executed with a calculated precision that left zero room for misinterpretation or benefit of the doubt. Sitting in that freezing, climate-controlled office, staring at the irrefutable evidence of their greed, a heavy weight settled deep into my chest. This was the quiet, agonizing realization I could not easily swallow. My entire family structure was an elaborate illusion built on a foundation of felony fraud. The pristine condo in the Pearl District, the tailored designer clothes, the exclusive country club memberships, all of it was purchased with the stolen security of a dying woman. I realized every single memory I possessed of my parents projecting wealth and success was actually a masterclass in deception. They played the role of the affluent elite while treating Sylvia as an expendable resource. They built their social standing on the back of her quiet terror. The psychological toll of knowing my blood relatives were nothing more than sophisticated predators made my stomach turn. I spent my whole life feeling inadequate next to their flashy success, only to discover their success was a crime scene. To maintain my cover and prevent my father from accelerating his offshore transfer, I was forced to attend a mandatory family brunch that Sunday. I drove to a high-end bistro in the city, steeling myself for the performance of a lifetime. The hostess guided me past tables of laughing families to a secluded corner booth where Richard, Pamela, and Vanessa were already seated. They were sipping sparkling mimosas, looking like a picturesque advertisement for upper-class domestic bliss. I slid into the leather booth, ordering a simple black coffee from a passing waiter. The atmosphere was a dizzying display of hypocrisy. Pamela cut into her perfectly poached Eggs Benedict, complaining loudly about the lack of loyalty in modern society. The smell of rich hollandaise sauce and expensive perfume suddenly made me nauseous. People just do not value family anymore, she sighed, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet that was undoubtedly paid for by the stolen trust fund. Everyone is always looking out for their own selfish interests. It is truly a tragic state of affairs. I kept my face rigidly neutral, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee to wash down the rising bile in my throat. I nodded politely, playing the role of the subdued, grieving daughter. Vanessa chimed in, scrolling through her social media feed, agreeing that true loyalty was impossible to find these days. The irony hung thick in the air, choking me, yet they remained oblivious to their own monstrous reflections. They sat there, chewing their expensive food, wearing stolen jewelry, lecturing me on the concept of loyalty. The casual atmosphere evaporated the moment the waiter cleared our porcelain plates. Richard leaned forward, folding his hands on the white linen tablecloth. His eyes, usually distant and indifferent, locked onto me with a sharp, predatory focus. I spoke with the developer yesterday, Richard stated, his tone casual but carrying a lethal undercurrent. Elias Thorne. He mentioned you paid a visit to the Astoria property on Wednesday. Why were you at the house, Adeline? The psychological tension in the booth spiked instantly. Pamela stopped wiping her mouth with her linen napkin. Vanessa looked up from her glowing phone screen, her brows furrowed in confusion. My father was actively covering his tracks, checking the perimeter of his crime scene. If he suspected I was inside the walls, if he thought I knew about the tin box, he would move the money today. I met his gaze directly, keeping my breathing slow and even, suppressing the sudden spike of adrenaline flooding my veins. I left my antique architectural calipers in the upstairs study during the funeral preparations. I lied, smoothly infusing my voice with just the right amount of wistful sadness. They belonged to my university mentor. I asked Mr. Thorne if I could quickly retrieve them before the demolition crews arrived and ruined the space. Richard studied my face for 5 excruciating seconds. The paranoia radiating from him was palpable. He was a man terrified of his own shadow, anticipating a trap at every turn. He searched my eyes for any hint of deception, any flicker of defiance. I gave him nothing. I stared back with the dull, exhausted expression of a daughter who had given up the fight. Finally, the tension broke. He leaned back against the leather cushion, the suspicion fading into arrogant dismissal. "Just let it go, Adeline," he instructed coldly, waving his hand as if swatting away a nuisance. "The house is gone. Stop clinging to the past. It is pathetic." I survived the brunch, excusing myself the moment the waiter dropped the leather checkbook on the table. I walked out into the brisk afternoon air, my hands trembling slightly as the immediate danger receded. I had successfully deflected his interrogation, but the encounter confirmed a terrifying reality. My father was on high alert. The timeline was shrinking faster than I anticipated. I unlocked my truck and slid into the driver's seat, letting out a long, shaky breath. Before I could insert the key into the ignition, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller identification displayed Harper's private office line. I answered immediately, expecting a mundane update on the court filings. "We have a serious complication," Harper said, her voice stripped of its usual composed cadence. "I just cracked the secondary holding shell your grandfather established before he passed. The offshore transfer is not our biggest problem anymore." "What did you find?" I asked my grip, tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Adeline Harper replied, the gravity of her words freezing the air in my lungs. The embezzled cash is only half the story. I pushed my truck past the speed limit, the tires throwing arcs of rainwater onto the empty highway shoulders. Harper had refused to explain the complication over the phone, citing the insecure nature of cellular networks. I arrived at her downtown high-rise exactly 20 minutes later, leaving my vehicle in a loading zone with the hazard lights blinking. I rode the elevator up to her floor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Harper was waiting for me in her tactical command center, standing over the glass desk with a thick, yellowed manila folder open under the harsh glow of a desk lamp. This was wedged beneath the false bottom of the rusted tin box, Harper said, her tone deadpan, but vibrating with an unmistakable intensity. We were so focused on the bank ledgers and the offshore transfers that we almost missed the physical weight of the container itself. She slid a stack of stiff, watermarked parchment across the smooth glass. I looked down, my eyes struggling to process the dense legal typography. It was a collection of property tax receipts and a master land deed, but the address listed did not belong to the Astoria Victorian or the luxury condo in Portland. It described a sprawling parcel of wilderness located deep in the Willamette Valley. 500 acres of old-growth timberland, Harper clarified, tapping a manicured fingernail against the official county seal. This is untouched Pacific Northwest forest, towering cedar trees, massive Douglas firs, and protected watersheds that have remained pristine for centuries. Your grandfather acquired the acreage long before you were born, but he did not merge it with the primary family trust. He was highly intelligent, and evidently he knew his own son was a financial predator. He shielded this specific property by placing it inside an obscure, standalone, limited liability company. That legal wall is the only reason your parents missed it during their initial liquidation sweep of Sylvia's estate. The scent of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and undisturbed natural history seemed to rise right off the yellowed paper. My grandfather loved the Pacific Northwest wilderness with a fierce, quiet devotion. He spent his weekends hiking those rugged trails, far away from the toxic, status-obsessed culture my parents embraced in the city. To him, real wealth was not measured in luxury vehicles or offshore bank accounts. It was measured in the towering canopy of centuries-old trees that survived storms, fires, and generations of human folly. I picked up the heavy parchment, the edges crumbling slightly against my fingertips. I scanned the secondary page, reading the beneficiary designation. My breath stopped. There, printed in crisp black ink and notarized by a federal judge decades ago, was my full name, Adeline Sterling. I was listed as the sole irrevocable beneficiary of the Timberland Company upon the event of my grandmother's passing. Neither Richard nor Pamela had any legal claim to this acreage. My grandfather had looked past their superficial greed and chosen to leave his most valuable, enduring legacy entirely to me. The emotional weight of that revelation settled into my chest, replacing the lingering sting of betrayal with a profound, grounding warmth. I was not forgotten. I was chosen. But the warmth quickly dissolved into a chilling realization as Harper pointed to a red notice stapled to the back of the deed. The property taxes on the 500 acres have been delinquent for 3 years, Harper explained, her gaze locking onto mine. Because the corporate entity was a blind holding, the county notices were routed to a defunct post office box. The total outstanding tax lien is nearly $40,000. The deadline to clear the debt before the county forecloses is the end of this current fiscal quarter, which is exactly 5 days from now. The scattered pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together, forming a terrifying picture of my father's actual strategy. Richard did not rush the sale of the Astoria house just to fund an offshore bank account. He rushed it because he discovered the existence of this timberland, saw the impending tax foreclosure, and needed immediate, untraceable cash to pay the county lien. In Oregon, paying the delinquent taxes on an abandoned property is the first crucial step to claiming ownership through adverse possession. My parents were attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar asset by quietly paying the overdue tax bill before anyone else realized the land existed. The stakes instantly shifted from a simple quest for financial restitution to a desperate fight for preservation. I knew exactly what Richard would do if he seized control of that land. He would not preserve the ancient cedars or protect the delicate river ecosystems. He would sell the parcel to the highest bidding commercial logging corporation. He would strip 500 acres of sacred, old-growth history and turn it into barren, muddy wasteland, just to inflate his own net worth. I could not let that happen. My profession, my passion, and my entire moral compass demanded that I protect those woods. The land was not just an inheritance. It was an ecological sanctuary that required a guardian. If my father pays that lien on Friday, the county clerk will officially record his holding company as the primary stakeholder. Harper warned, folding her arms across her charcoal blazer. We will have to spend years dragging him through appellate courts to reverse the claim. And by then, the logging machines will have already decimated the forest. We need to pay the taxes first. We need to register you as the legal owner on the county deed today. I did not waste time debating the logistics. I left Harper's office and drove straight to my local credit union branch. I sat across from a bewildered loan officer, instructing her to liquidate every single asset I possessed. The teller hesitated, looking at her screen and then back at my face, asking if I was certain I wanted to incur the early withdrawal penalties on my retirement accounts. I told her to finalize the transfer immediately. I drained my modest checking account, closed my emergency savings fund, and cashed out the meager portfolio I had painstakingly built over the last 6 years of restoring historic baseboards. It was every penny I owned in the world, reduced to a single certified cashier's check made payable to the Willamette County tax assessor. I watched the digital numbers on my banking app drop to zero, feeling a strange, intoxicating blend of terror and absolute freedom. Money was just a tool, and I was about to use my meager resources to shatter a dynasty. The county administration building was a brutalist concrete structure that smelled of floor wax and stale bureaucracy. I pulled a numbered paper ticket and waited in a row of hard plastic chairs, my leg bouncing with unchecked nervous energy. Every time the heavy glass doors swung open, I expected to see Richard walking through, flanked by his high-priced corporate attorneys, ready to snatch the prize away at the final second. But the doors only admitted bored citizens renewing vehicle registrations and filing mundane zoning permits. When my number finally flashed on the digital display board, I approached the thick plexiglass window. I slid the certified check, the original tin box deed, and my government identification across the counter. The clerk, an older woman wearing thick reading glasses, scrutinized the paperwork with an agonizingly slow precision. She typed a long sequence of numbers into her outdated computer terminal, the clacking of the keyboard echoing loudly in the quiet lobby. I held my breath, waiting for a red flag, a legal block, or a notification that someone had beaten me to the ledger. The printer whirred to life, spitting out a thick stack of official receipts. The clerk picked up a heavy steel embosser and clamped it down on the top page, leaving a raised, permanent seal of the county government. She slid the documents back under the plexiglass partition. "You are all set, Ms. Sterling," she announced, her voice entirely devoid of the monumental gravity of the moment. "The delinquent lien is fully satisfied, and the title transfer has been officially recorded in the municipal registry. You are the sole legal owner of the parcel." I walked out of the concrete building and stood on the front steps, letting the cold Oregon wind wash over my face. I looked down at the embossed deed resting in my hands. The physical obstacle was cleared, and the hidden asset was secured. But more importantly, I had just armed the most lethal, invisible trap my family could ever stumble into. By Friday morning, Richard would confidently strut into this exact same building, checkbook in hand, ready to quietly execute his grand theft. He would approach that plexiglass window, expecting to buy an empire. Instead, the clerk would inform him that the taxes were already paid, the deed was already locked, and the naive, grieving daughter he had dismissed as a nuisance was now holding the keys to a multi-million-dollar fortress. My parents thought they were untouchable, but they had no idea they were walking blindly into a minefield I had just finished digging. The sanctuary of the historic First Presbyterian Church offered a quiet, vast refuge from the chaotic noise of downtown Portland traffic. I stood 40 feet above the polished mahogany pews, balanced carefully on a tiered aluminum scaffold. My gloved fingers guided a fine, bristled brush over a century-old stained glass window frame, sweeping away decades of accumulated soot. Restoring vintage architecture required a profound level of patience and a steady hand. You had to respect the original materials, coaxing the hidden beauty out from underneath layers of neglect. My grandmother taught me that precise philosophy when I was just a child. She always said true craftsmanship was about preserving history, not erasing it for modern convenience. I focused intensely on the fragile lead joints holding the brilliant colored glass together, enjoying the rhythmic scrape of my small hand trowel against the stone wall. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cavernous nave groaned open, shattering the peaceful silence of the empty building. I paused my delicate work and looked down through the metal grating of the elevated platform. A solitary figure marched down the central aisle, his expensive leather dress shoes striking the stone floor with a sharp, frantic cadence. It was Richard. My stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. My father never visited my restoration job sites. He considered manual labor beneath his elevated social status, viewing my chosen profession as a glorified, dirty hobby rather than a legitimate career. Today, however, his usual immaculate presentation was noticeably fractured. His tailored silk tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar. His charcoal suit jacket billowed wildly as he walked, his posture lacking its typical arrogant grace. He spotted my silhouette near the vaulted ceiling and immediately marched toward the structure. Without a single word of greeting, he began climbing the narrow metal ladder attached to the side of the scaffolding. The thin aluminum planks rattled and swayed under his sudden, heavy weight. He reached my level, his chest heaving, his face flushed with an uncharacteristic, panicked energy. We were trapped together in a tight, precarious space high above the ground floor, the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass and casting colored shadows across his furious features. He did not bother offering a standard hello or asking about my day. His eyes darted around the empty sanctuary corners before locking onto my face with a terrifying, predatory intensity. "Who paid the county tax lien?" he demanded. His voice a harsh, echoing whisper that barely contained his boiling rage. I stared back at him, forcing my facial muscles to remain entirely slack and unbothered. "What are you talking about?" I asked, tilting my head to the side in a display of feigned confusion. I kept my grip loose on the wooden handle of my trowel, projecting the harmless image of a bewildered daughter interrupted during a routine workday. "Do not play games with me today, Adeline," he snapped, taking a threatening step forward, until his expensive cologne overpowered the smell of stone dust. "The county clerk rejected my transfer application this morning. An anonymous entity settled the delinquent property taxes on the Willamette timber parcel. Are you talking to an estate lawyer behind my back? Did you hire someone to dig into Sylvia's private holding companies?" The paranoia radiating from him was palpable, thick and suffocating like a toxic smoke. He had marched into the tax assessor office, expecting a quiet, easy victory, only to discover a locked door and a satisfied ledger. He was terrified, searching frantically for the invisible enemy who had stolen his multi-million-dollar prize. I maintained my blank expression, blinking slowly to emphasize my apparent lack of comprehension. "I have no idea what a holding company is, Dad," I replied, keeping my vocal tone soft and slightly timid. "I have been up here on this platform since dawn, working on the fragile glass panes. Are you saying Grandma owned another piece of land somewhere in the valley?" The naive, innocent response seemed to throw him off balance. He searched my eyes for any trace of deception, his jaw muscles clenching so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He wanted to believe I was clueless, because acknowledging my strategic capability meant confronting his own catastrophic failure. He leaned closer, invading my personal space, dropping the sophisticated urban elite persona to reveal the ruthless, cornered bully hiding underneath the designer suit. If you are interfering with private family business, you will regret it for the rest of your life, he warned, his tone dropping to a lethal, vibrating octave. I play golf every single weekend with 3 different executive directors on the State Historical Preservation Board. One phone call from my office and your precious historic restoration licenses disappear overnight. Your professional reputation will be ruined. You will never work in this specialized sector again. Do you understand me? My own father was standing 40 feet in the air, threatening to destroy my entire livelihood, just to protect the secret wealth he stole from his dying mother. The betrayal was no longer just a distant financial crime recorded on paper. It was deeply personal, toxic, and unrelenting in its cruelty. He was willing to burn my career to ashes to cover his own tracks. I lowered my gaze, staring submissively at the scuffed toes of my leather work boots, letting him believe his psychological intimidation tactic had succeeded. I understand, I whispered, projecting a fragile, defeated surrender. He stared at me for another long, agonizing moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly, before he finally turned away. He descended the steep metal ladder much faster than he climbed it, his movements sharp and jerky. I stood frozen on the platform, watching his dark suit disappear through the heavy sanctuary doors, listening to the heavy iron latch click shut behind him. The exact second the church returned to absolute silence, a severe tremor seized both of my hands. I dropped the small scraping trowel. It clattered loudly against the aluminum grating, the metallic sound ringing through the empty nave. My pulse roared in my ears, a deafening drumbeat, fueled by pure, unfiltered adrenaline. I pulled off my dusty leather work gloves, reaching deep into the pocket of my canvas trousers to retrieve my cell phone. My fingers shook uncontrollably as I swiped the screen and dialed Harper's direct office line. She answered on the first ring, her greeting crisp and efficient. "Richard just ambushed me at the church site," I said, my voice hardening, stripping away the timid facade I had just performed for his benefit. "He tried to pay the delinquent timber taxes and hit the brick wall we built. He knows someone intervened. He threatened to call the board and revoke my professional operating licenses if he discovers I was involved." Harper released a sharp, humorless breath over the cellular connection. "He is panicking," she stated, clinically assessing the psychological shift. "The blind trust was his golden parachute, and you just cut the cords while he was in free fall. If he is issuing overt career threats, he knows the walls are rapidly closing in around him. We cannot wait for the civil courts to process our injunction, quietly, behind closed doors. We need to shatter his public reputation before he can marshal his vast resources to attack yours." I looked out over the quiet, empty church pews, the cold, calculating fury settling deep into my marrow. The time for playing passive defense was officially over. I was tired of hiding in the shadows while my family paraded their stolen wealth. "We are going to the anniversary gala," I told her. My words crisp and definitive, leaving zero room for hesitation. "My parents are throwing a lavish catered party this weekend to celebrate their fake legacy with all their wealthy friends. We will use their own captive audience against them. We will serve the lawsuit on the dance floor." Harper appeared instantly, her tone shifting into a sharp, predatory excitement. She began outlining the precise legal maneuvers we needed to coordinate with private process servers to breach the exclusive venue. The overarching conflict had officially shifted gears. I was no longer just uncovering their hidden secrets or securing stolen deeds. I was actively setting the stage for their total, inescapable, public ruin. The heavy cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox the following afternoon. It featured ornate gold foil lettering and a thick wax seal stamped with my parents' intertwined initials. I broke the brittle red wax, pulling out a stiff cardstock invitation. Richard and Pamela requested the honor of my presence at their 35th wedding anniversary gala. The chosen venue was a highly exclusive, sprawling country club perched on the steep bluffs overlooking the Willamette River. Every single embossed letter on that card, Every ounce of imported champagne they planned to pour for their wealthy guests was directly financed by my grandmother's prolonged suffering. The sheer audacity of the event was breathtaking. They were throwing a public coronation for themselves, funding the extravagant celebration using a stolen, bloody treasure. My cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, displaying a rapid succession of text messages from Vanessa. She sent a highly detailed list of strict wardrobe requirements for the upcoming event. Please do not wear those hideous flat shoes you always drag around the restoration sites, she typed. The photographer from the society pages will be taking official family portraits at 8 o'clock sharp in the main ballroom. We need you to look presentable, not like a tired contractor. Try to find a tasteful gown that actually fits your figure for once. The digital message was a classic psychological jab, treating my existence as a potential embarrassment that might ruin their pristine visual aesthetic. A few weeks ago, her condescending words would have stung my deeply ingrained insecurities, making me feel small and inadequate. Now, the insult just fueled the cold engine running inside my chest. I did not bother typing a reply. I had much larger logistical puzzles to solve before the weekend arrived. To stop my father from migrating his liquid capital to the Cayman Islands, Harper needed to file an emergency ex parte injunction in federal court. However, freezing international corporate assets required posting a substantial financial bond to indemnify the judicial system against frivolous lawsuits. I had already drained my life savings to pay the delinquent property taxes on the Willamette parcel. I was entirely broke on paper, but I held the clear deed to an ecological gold mine. I reached out to a former architectural client named David Kensington, a wealthy private equity investor whose historic mansion I had painstakingly restored 2 years prior. We met at a discreet coffee shop tucked away in the Pearl District. I presented the embossed timberland deed and requested a short-term, high-yield collateralized loan against the 500 acres of untouched cedar. David recognized the astronomical value of the pristine wilderness immediately. He knew the land was worth 10 times the amount I was asking to borrow. Within 48 hours, a wire transfer containing a significant sum of liquid cash hit my newly established escrow account. I carried the printed bank confirmation directly to Harper's downtown office. She sat behind her broad glass desk, flanked by a towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a nondescript gray suit. This was the private process server we hired for the weekend. Harper laid out the thick stacks of court filings, her manicured finger tapping the dense legal paragraphs to emphasize her strategy. "We are not just filing a standard civil claim for stolen inheritance," she explained, her tone sharp and precise. "We are invoking the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, bringing a civil RICO suit against your parents. Because Richard and Pamela conspired across state lines, utilizing digital wire transfers to move embezzled trust funds into offshore shells, they committed federal financial crimes. We are also filing a severe injunction for elder financial abuse based on Sylvia's documented written confessions. The federal judge reviewed our submitted bank ledgers this morning and granted the asset freeze without hesitation." Harper continued, handing a copy of the judge's order to the man in the gray suit. "Your father's offshore accounts are currently locked tight. He just does not realize it yet." The legal maneuvering was incredibly complex, yet it remained entirely grounded in the ruthless, logical framework of American corporate law. My parents believed they could hide behind impenetrable banking veils, but they failed to anticipate a coordinated federal strike targeting their specific points of vulnerability. Harper turned her attention to the quiet process server outlining the infiltration strategy. The country club maintained a notoriously strict guest list and heavy private security at the front gates. We needed a flawless method to bypass the guards and get the legal summons directly into Richard's hands in front of his wealthy peers. Since I was explicitly invited as a distinguished family member, the server would attend the event disguised as my personal date. He would blend perfectly into the sea of wealthy socialites until the exact moment I gave the designated signal. The trap was set, meticulously designed to spring shut in the most public, humiliating arena possible. I spent the entire night before the gala sitting alone in my quiet apartment, listening to the rain tap softly against the living room window panes. The rusted tin box sat open on my dining table, surrounded by the devastating financial records that dictated the last 5 years of my family's deception. I picked up Sylvia's cracked leather diary one last time. I traced the faded blue ink of her final entries, feeling the profound, lingering terror she endured during her last days on Earth. The quiet, suffocating grief that had paralyzed me during her rainy funeral had entirely evaporated. In its place, an undeniable, unyielding power radiated through my veins, steady and cold. My grandmother entrusted me with this terrible knowledge because she knew I possessed the structural fortitude to tear down the rotting dynasty my parents built. She knew I could withstand the brutal fallout of exposing the truth. I closed the small book and placed it carefully back inside the metal container. I walked into my bedroom and opened the sliding closet doors. I bypassed my sturdy canvas work clothes and heavy leather boots, reaching into the dark back corner to retrieve a simple, elegant black dress. It lacked the flashy sequins or ostentatious designer labels my mother and sister constantly coveted. It was stark, minimalist, and perfectly tailored to my frame. I laid the dark fabric across my mattress, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles with the flat of my palm. I was not going to this lavish party to celebrate a fake milestone or pose for superficial society photographs. I was going to perform a surgical autopsy on my family's lies, and I planned to make sure every single guest in that ballroom witnessed the exact moment the illusion bled out on the polished floor. The Willamette River flowed quietly beneath the steep coastal bluffs, a dark ribbon of water reflecting the bright, unnatural glow of the country club. I handed my keys to a valet wearing a crisp white uniform and walked up the sweeping stone staircase leading to the grand ballroom. The private venue was a fortress of exclusivity, featuring towering Corinthian columns and expansive glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. I stepped through the heavy brass doors, presenting my gilded invitation to the security detail stationed in the foyer. Beside me stood the man Harper had hired the private process server, acting as my escort for the evening. He wore a tailored navy suit that helped him blend seamlessly into the sea of corporate executives and wealthy socialites currently filling the room. The air inside the ballroom was thick with the scent of roasted tenderloin, imported orchids, and expensive perfumes. A string quartet played a classical piece in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the crime my parents were celebrating. I navigated the crowded floor, sidestepping waiters carrying silver trays of champagne flutes. The elite guests were discussing their latest overseas investments, real estate acquisitions, and political maneuvers. I walked past a table where a local municipal judge was laughing with a prominent property developer, both unaware that the hosts of this lavish event were active felons. I spotted my family holding court near the center of the room. Pamela stood radiating a performative maternal warmth, draped in an elegant emerald green evening gown. Around her neck rested a thick collar of pristine diamonds that caught the light with every slight movement. The jewelry was brand new, a lavish purchase funded directly by the silent suffering of the woman whose grave was barely a month old. Vanessa hovered nearby, holding a martini glass, wearing a custom silk dress that likely cost more than my entire annual salary as a historic home restorer. I approached their circle, keeping my posture straight and my facial expression carefully neutral. My mother turned her practiced smile, faltering slightly, as her eyes swept over my minimalist black dress. She reached out, placing a cold, manicured hand on my shoulder. "Adeline, you actually came," Pamela said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that carried just enough volume for the surrounding guests to hear. "I am so glad you decided to leave your dusty work sites for one night. Though I do wish you had consulted my stylist. That dress is a bit drab for such a monumental occasion, do you not think? It looks like you are attending a funeral." The hypocrisy of her statement struck a harsh chord in my chest, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "I am comfortable, Mother," I replied evenly, ignoring Vanessa as she rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink. "Well, at least you brought a handsome guest," Pamela added, looking at the broad-shouldered man standing quietly by my side. She offered him a dazzling smile, unaware that the charming stranger she was trying to impress carried federal court documents folded neatly inside his breast pocket. "We are just thrilled you are trying to be part of the family again, Adeline. Tonight is about looking forward, putting the past behind us, and celebrating the legacy we have built." I nodded, slowly stepping back into the periphery of the crowd as the event coordinator chimed a small, silver bell, signaling the guests to take their seats for the main dinner service. I did not sit at the head table with my family. I chose a seat near the back of the room, positioning myself in the shadows where I could observe the entire floor. The pacing of the evening felt like a slow, deliberate countdown. Waiters cleared the empty salad plates, the clinking of expensive silverware echoing softly underneath the hum of polite conversation. When the main courses were finished, the string quartet stopped playing. The room fell into an expectant hush as Richard stood up from the center table, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal water glass. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket and stepped up to the small mahogany podium positioned at the edge of the dance floor. He gripped the microphone, projecting an aura of dignified success. 35 years ago, Pamela and I started with nothing but a shared vision. Richard began his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and corporate partners, feeding off their undivided attention. We built this life through sacrifice, relentless hard work, and a commitment to protecting our loved ones. In today's chaotic world, true wealth is not just about financial success. It is about the legacy you leave behind for the next generation. It is about building a foundation so strong that nothing can tear it down. I sat in the dim lighting at the back of the hall, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening to the sheer, unadulterated poison of his speech. He was standing on a stage paid for by embezzled funds, preaching about sacrifice, while holding the secret that he terrorized his own mother into a premature grave. He raised his champagne flute, a picture of perfect, self-made American prosperity, asking the room to toast to honesty, integrity, and family legacy. The guests erupted into enthusiastic applause, raising their glasses in a synchronized display of blind admiration. They saw a titan of industry. I saw a hollow, frightened thief standing on top of a rotting floorboard. The applause gradually died down, replaced by the soft murmur of conversations resuming and the clatter of porcelain as the catering staff began serving decadent chocolate desserts. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy brass doors at the entrance of the ballroom. The clock in my mind ticked louder with every passing second. We were running out of time. If Richard managed to leave this venue and finalize his overseas transfer in the morning, the federal injunction would face immense jurisdictional hurdles. The trap had to snap shut right now. The brass doors opened quietly. Harper slipped into the back of the room, her presence commanding yet discreet. She wore a sharp, tailored pantsuit, her expression focused and lethal. Walking right beside her was the second private process server we had retained, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Harper scanned the dim edges of the ballroom until her eyes locked onto mine. She gave me a single, microscopic nod. The legal blockade was firmly in place. The overseas accounts were officially frozen by the federal judge just an hour prior. Richard was currently celebrating a financial empire that no longer existed. I stood up from my chair, pushing it back quietly against the carpet. My designated date, the first process server, stepped away from the table and fell into step slightly behind me. Harper and her associate moved along the opposite wall, closing the perimeter. The pacing shifted from a slow burn to a rapid, undeniable strike. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, my simple black dress moving like a shadow through the glittering, oblivious crowd. Richard had returned to his seat at the head table, laughing loudly at a joke told by a prominent city councilman sitting to his right. Pamela was leaning over, inspecting the dessert presentation, while Vanessa typed rapidly on her phone, likely posting photographs of the extravagant decor. None of them noticed my approach until I was standing directly behind Richard's chair. The ambient noise of the party seemed to fade into a dull, rushing hum in my ears. I placed my hand firmly on the back of my father's chair, feeling the rigid tension in his spine as he turned around, annoyed by the sudden interruption. His smile vanished the moment he saw my face, the arrogance draining from his features, replaced by that familiar, paranoid edge. He leaned back, his eyes darting to the imposing man standing right over my shoulder. "What are you doing over here?" Adeline Huichard asked in a harsh whisper, trying to maintain his polite facade for the benefit of the councilman sitting inches away. "Go back to your table. We are finishing our meals." I leaned down, placing myself directly between my parents, invading their pristine personal space. I smelled the heavy hollandaise from the dinner service and the sharp bite of Pamela's imported perfume. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I kept my tone level, quiet, and terrifyingly precise. "I was just wondering, Dad," I whispered, ensuring my words only reached his ears and my mother's. "How are the property taxes on the Willamette timberland coming along?" All color vanished from my father's face. The healthy, sun-kissed tan he carefully maintained year-round drained away in a matter of seconds, leaving a sickly, chalky pallor that made him look his actual age. The heavy silver dessert spoon slipped from his loosened grip, clattering loudly against his fine bone china plate. He stared at me, his jaw working silently, unable to process how the highly guarded secret he had desperately tried to secure at the county clerk office that very morning was now hanging in the air over his anniversary dinner. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a rotting floorboard, waiting for the inevitable, sickening drop into the dark. Before he could formulate a deflection or demand that I lower my voice, the heavy brass doors of the trap swung shut. The man acting as my designated escort stepped smoothly out of my shadow. Harper materialized on the opposite side of the table, flanked by her own associate. The three of them moved with the synchronized, lethal precision of a tactical strike team. They bypassed the hovering waitstaff and positioned themselves directly behind Richard, Pamela, and Vanessa. The coordinated movement was so fluid that the surrounding guests barely registered the shift until it was already too late. 3 thick, dense manila envelopes dropped onto the crisp, white linen tablecloth simultaneously. The dull thud of the legal filings drowned out the classical string music playing in the background. The servers did not offer polite greetings or apologize for the interruption. "You have been formally served," the man in the navy suit stated, his tone carrying the cold, undeniable authority of the federal judicial system. He turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, his duty fulfilled, leaving the explosive documents resting next to my parents' melting chocolate torts. I took a deliberate step backward, creating a strict physical boundary between myself and the crumbling facade of my family. I did not scream. I did not raise my pitch into the realm of hysterics, knowing that emotional outbursts were easily dismissed by this crowd as instability. I modulated my vocal register to a clear, carrying frequency, ensuring my words penetrated the immediate sphere of the head table and spilled directly into the surrounding clusters of corporate executives and municipal politicians. I delivered the truth with the exact same surgical precision I used to restore fragile historic structures. "We filed a civil racketeering lawsuit this afternoon in federal court," I announced, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my father as he stared at the sealed envelope as if it were a live incendiary device. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted our emergency ex parte injunction. Every single offshore holding shell you established in the Caribbean to hide my grandmother's money is currently frozen tight. You cannot access a single cent of that stolen capital to fund your legal defense. Pamela let out a high-pitched, brittle laugh, frantically looking at the prominent city councilman seated to her right. The local politician had already pushed his chair back from the table, his expression shifting from jovial intoxication to rigid alarm. "Oh, Adeline has always had a very vivid imagination," my mother chuckled, her hand trembling so badly the expensive new diamonds around her neck vibrated against her collarbone. This is just a terrible misunderstanding over a minor probate issue regarding her grandmother. Please, everyone, let us return to the celebration. Do not let this silly interruption ruin a beautiful evening. But Vanessa did not possess the same seasoned discipline for high society denial. She ripped the protective tab off her manila envelope, pulling out a thick stack of photocopied bank ledgers and property transfer deeds. I watched her perfectly manicured nails drag across the pages. She saw the familiar sloping cursive handwriting of the woman whose trust fund paid for her luxurious lifestyle. She saw the highlighted withdrawal records, matching the exact purchase date of her pristine SUV, alongside the staggering capital injections that propped up her failed organic wellness company. The color rushed out of my sister's face, replacing her arrogant boredom with genuine, unfiltered horror. Her entire identity as a successful, self-made entrepreneur shattered the moment she realized her lifestyle was funded by felony theft. It is not a misunderstanding, I continued, my voice steady, slicing through Pamela's desperate attempt at damage control like a steel blade. Those documents contain ironclad proof of severe elder financial abuse. Sylvia kept a meticulous diary, documenting every time you forced her to sign blank checks under the threat of psychiatric commitment. I turned my attention to my sister, who was currently hyperventilating over the ledger copies, her chest heaving as the reality of her complicity set in. I also placed a secondary judicial lien on your new vehicle, Vanessa, as well as the luxury penthouse in the Pearl District. Your physical assets are locked and heavily leveraged until the stolen inheritance is fully recovered by the estate. Richard finally found his voice, issuing a ragged, desperate rasp that sounded nothing like the booming titan of industry who had just delivered a toast seconds ago. "You cannot freeze my overseas portfolios," he stammered, gripping the edge of the mahogany table until his knuckles turned white. "You do not have the liquid capital to post the required indemnity bonds for a federal injunction. I checked your banking records last month. You are broke, Adeline." "I have the Willamette property," I corrected smoothly, watching the final spark of arrogant resistance extinguish in his eyes. "I secured a high-yield collateralized loan against the 500 acres of old-growth cedar your father left to me. I paid the delinquent taxes you purposely missed. The master deed is officially registered in my name at the county clerk office. I own the historical land trust, and I used it to fund your prosecution." The surgical exposure yielded immediate, devastating results. The hushed whispers rippling through the ballroom suddenly amplified into a chaotic murmur. The phrase elder abuse floated through the crowd like a highly contagious virus passing from table to table. A prominent real estate developer, seated at the adjacent table, slowly stood up, retrieving his suit jacket from the back of his chair. He did not offer a polite excuse or a sympathetic nod. He simply turned his back on my parents and walked toward the exit. The city councilman followed suit, dropping his cloth napkin onto the floor and distancing himself from the toxic fallout as quickly as his legs could carry him. Within 60 seconds, a wide, empty perimeter formed around the center table. The wealthy elite were deeply intolerant of public scandal, especially when it involved federal racketeering charges and defrauding a dying widow. My grandmother used to host modest Sunday dinners in her kitchen, filling her old Victorian home with genuine warmth and laughter. My parents tried to manufacture that same respect by purchasing a ballroom full of strangers, only to watch their expensive audience abandon them at the first sign of legal ruin. My parents sat isolated in the center of their own lavish party. The decadent chocolate desserts melting on their expensive porcelain plates looked like dark mud. The performative dynasty they had ruthlessly constructed over 35 years lay shattered on the polished floor, the structural supports entirely kicked away. They were no longer the envy of the high society circuit. They were exposed as sophisticated thieves, cowardly predators who preyed on a vulnerable woman to sustain an illusion of grandeur. The string orchestra had stopped playing. The ballroom was silent, save for the sound of retreating footsteps and Vanessa's quiet, panicked sobbing. I stood my ground, feeling the cold, undeniable strength of justice settling over the ruins of their greed. My grandmother was finally vindicated in the eyes of the public, but my father's humiliated, venomous glare promised that a cornered predator would always attempt one final, desperate counterattack before going down. The immediate fallout of the country club gala radiated through the early morning hours like a seismic aftershock. Sunlight pierced the slatted blinds of my apartment, illuminating the dust motes hovering above my scuffed oak dining table. A sharp, rhythmic knock interrupted the quiet dawn. I opened the door to find a bonded courier wearing a gray uniform holding a thick legal parcel. The return address, printed on the stiff cardboard, belonged to one of the most expensive corporate defense firms in the Pacific Northwest. My father had spent the hours since his public humiliation rallying his high-priced infantry. I tore open the heavy envelope, pulling out a formal cease and desist order. The document was a masterpiece of expensive legal fiction. Richard had instructed his newly retained attorneys to claim my grandmother's cracked leather diary was a crude forgery. They argued the handwritten bank ledgers were circumstantial anomalies resulting from poor bookkeeping, demanding I withdraw the federal injunction by noon or face ruinous defamation counterclaims. They tried to paint me as a disgruntled, estranged daughter, fabricating a vengeful narrative to steal a legitimate estate. I scanned the threatening paragraphs, feeling my pulse remain perfectly steady. 3 weeks ago, a letter bearing that prestigious corporate letterhead would have terrified me, forcing me into a quiet retreat. Today, it was merely paper. I snapped a clear digital photograph of the threat and forwarded it to Harper. Her reply arrived within 60 seconds. "A cornered animal bares its teeth right before the steel trap closes," she typed. "Let them waste their retainer on empty bluster. We hold the high ground." My mobile phone buzzed again, vibrating intensely against the table surface. The caller identification displayed my mother's private cell number. Pamela did not usually place phone calls before 10 in the morning, preferring to let her personal assistant handle early correspondence. I pressed the accept button, simultaneously activating the digital recording application on my device. Oregon law required only one party to consent to an audio recording, a legal nuance I intended to exploit without hesitation. "Adeline, please tell me you are calling off this insane crusade," Pamela sobbed into the receiver. Her voice was ragged, stripped of the polished, aristocratic cadence she had perfected over decades of social climbing. The weeping sounded genuine, fueled by the sheer terror of losing her pristine social standing and financial security. "Your father was awake all night meeting with crisis managers. The country club suspended our membership pending an internal review. His business partners are freezing our domestic joint ventures. You are tearing this family apart over a terrible misunderstanding." I stared at the blank apartment wall, keeping my vocal tone entirely detached from her emotional warfare. "It is not a misunderstanding, Mother. You funded a lavish gala with capital stolen from a dying woman. You used her failing health to bypass the probate courts. We took care of Sylvia for years," Pamela shrieked, the thin veneer of maternal sorrow fracturing to reveal the bitter, calculating resentment hiding beneath. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it was dealing with her declining health? The endless medical appointments, the constant complaints about the cost of her care. We sacrificed our peak earning years to manage her complicated estate. I just took what I was owed. She owed us for keeping her out of a miserable state-run nursing facility." The confession hung in the digital audio file, pristine and damning. She had just admitted to treating the irrevocable trust fund as a personal compensation package, justifying the embezzlement as a crude form of back pay. I tapped the screen, saving the encrypted audio file. "You were not her caregivers," I replied coldly, feeling the last remaining thread of familial obligation sever. "You were her captors." I disconnected the call, letting the silence fill my apartment once more. The family unit, bonded solely by mutual greed, was actively fracturing under the intense pressure of the federal asset freeze. Less than an hour later, Vanessa requested an urgent video conference. When her face appeared on my laptop screen, she looked unrecognizable. Her expensive designer makeup was smeared, and her eyes were bloodshot. She sat in the expansive living room of her heavily leveraged Pearl District condo, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee. The arrogant superiority she paraded around my kitchen just a few days prior had evaporated into pure panic. "Adeline, you have to release the judicial lien on my vehicle and my apartment," Vanessa pleaded, her voice trembling. "My premium credit cards were declined at the grocery store this morning. The bank froze my primary checking accounts because they are linked to Dad's offshore holding shells. I have nothing left to live on." "The stolen capital funded those accounts," I reminded her, studying my sister's frantic expression through the monitor. "The federal court considers your assets to be fruits of the initial crime." "I will testify against them," Vanessa blurted out, throwing our parents under the judicial bus without a single second of hesitation. "I can provide the court with the exact dates Dad forced me to sign those fraudulent business loan applications for my wellness brand. I know where Mom hides the secondary ledger books in the penthouse. I will give Harper everything she needs to put them behind bars. Just let me keep the condo and the car. Please, I cannot survive bankruptcy." The desperate offer showcased the ugly, realistic collapse of a dynasty built on superficial loyalty. Vanessa was perfectly willing to send our parents to federal prison if it meant preserving her luxury lifestyle and avoiding public humiliation. I looked at the screen, feeling a profound sense of pity replace the lingering resentment I held toward her. "You are missing the point, Vanessa. I am not a prosecutor negotiating a plea deal. I am recovering my grandmother's stolen dignity. You spent the stolen money. You have to face the legal consequence." I closed the laptop, severing the connection, leaving her alone with the financial wreckage. I forwarded the recorded conversation with my mother directly to Harper's secure server. By early afternoon, I sat in her downtown high-rise office, watching the pragmatic litigator compile the final pieces of our offensive strategy. Richard's expensive defense attorney thought he could drag this fight out for years, using endless procedural delays and defamation threats. He believed he could bankrupt my legal fund by turning the lawsuit into a grueling war of attrition. Harper uploaded the audio file into the federal court docket system, attaching it to a motion for expedited summary judgment. "They claim the diary is a recent forgery," Harper noted, clicking her wireless mouse to finalize the submission. "But your architectural photographs prove otherwise." During my initial visit to the Astoria property, I had carefully documented the removal of the original 1890s plaster. The high-resolution images captured the undisturbed horsehair insulation and the unique oxidation patterns on the tin box, proving scientifically that the hidden compartment had remained sealed for months. The physical forensic evidence of the historic lath and plaster perfectly corroborated the timeline written in the leather diary, rendering Richard's forgery defense mathematically impossible to sustain in front of a judge. The legal trap was now hermetically sealed. My parents suddenly realized their vast accumulated wealth could not outmaneuver documented physical truth. Their high-priced defense team reviewed the newly submitted audio confession and the structural photographs, quickly advising Richard to abandon his confrontational counterattack. The realization that they were facing genuine federal prison sentences rather than a mere civil penalty broke their remaining resolve. The battlefield shifted from an arrogant defense to a desperate plea for survival, hinting at a crushing, definitive resolution. 6 months passed, turning the crisp coastal autumn into a bitter, relentless Oregon winter. The turning of the calendar brought a definitive end to the war. We did not finish this battle in a grand, oak-paneled courtroom with a theatrical jury and a pounding gavel. High-stakes corporate and family litigation rarely concludes in a public trial. Instead, the final defeat occurred inside a sterile, glass-walled mediation room on the 40th floor of a downtown legal firm. The space smelled of stale coffee ozone from the copy machines and profound, suffocating defeat. I sat next to Harper at a long mahogany table, my hands resting quietly in my lap. Across the polished wooden expanse sat the hollow, trembling remnants of my family. Richard and Pamela had physically aged a decade in a matter of 24 weeks. The constant, agonizing stress of facing federal indictments for elder financial abuse had stripped away their aristocratic veneer. My father, once a proud titan of local industry, now possessed an unhealthy, sallow complexion. He had lost a significant amount of weight. His expensive tailored suit hung loosely off his shoulders, the fabric pooling awkwardly around his wrists. He stared at the fixed stack of settlement documents resting in front of him, his fingers tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against the leather portfolio. My mother sat rigidly beside him, projecting none of her usual matriarchal dominance. The roots of her blonde hair showed a stark, natural white, revealing she had abandoned her weekly salon appointments to hide from the relentless public scrutiny. The society pages had ruthlessly chronicled the collapse of their social standing. Their country club membership was permanently revoked. Their business partners severed all joint ventures to distance themselves from the toxic fallout of the racketeering charges. They were ruined, confined to their luxury condo, while the exorbitant hourly legal fees slowly drained whatever legitimate funds they had left. The federal mediator, a retired circuit court judge wearing a drab gray suit, cleared his throat. He adjusted his reading glasses and opened the master dossier. "The terms of the settlement are straightforward and non-negotiable," he stated, his voice a calm, neutral drone that amplified the severe reality of the room. "To avoid a criminal trial and potential federal incarceration for felony fraud, the defendants agree to full capitulation. They will sign over the entirety of the remaining liquid assets derived from the fraudulent sale of the Astoria estate. Furthermore, they will authorize the immediate repatriation of all capital currently frozen in the offshore holding shells." I listened to the mediator list the financial concessions, feeling a profound sense of validation. The wealth they stole from Sylvia was finally returning to its rightful designated trust. The ledgers were balancing. Noticeably absent from the mediation table was my sister. Vanessa was not invited to sign the settlement because she no longer possessed any assets to surrender. Her desperate attempt to maintain her superficial lifestyle had ended in a spectacular, humiliating crash. 2 months prior, she was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The judicial lien Harper placed on her property had choked her cash flow to zero. The bank foreclosed on her Pearl District condo. A pair of repo men towed her pristine $90,000 luxury SUV out of an underground parking garage, while her wealthy friends watched in stunned silence. She was currently renting a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a mundane administrative job left behind by the social circle she tried so desperately to impress. Richard picked up a heavy silver pen provided by his defense attorney. He hovered the ink over the signature line of the primary asset forfeiture agreement. He hesitated, his hand shaking. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the table. I expected to see a flicker of remorse, a sudden realization of the terrible pain he inflicted on his own mother. I waited for a heartfelt apology, a plea for forgiveness from the daughter he had dismissed and marginalized for 28 years. Instead, I saw only bitter, venomous resentment. His gaze was hard, filled with the dark, unyielding anger of a predator caught in a trap. He did not regret stealing the inheritance. He only regretted leaving the tin box hidden inside the lath and plaster. Pamela refused to look at me. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the mahogany table, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching beneath her pale skin. They were stripped of their wealth, their status, and their pride, yet they clung desperately to their toxic entitlement. Richard pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the metal nib echoing in the silent room sounded like a lock tumbling into place. He signed his name, authorizing the transfer of millions of dollars back into my control. Pamela took the pen next, her signature jagged and rushed. The mediator collected the documents verifying the ink before sliding the final page across the table. "The final stipulation of the settlement requires a permanent severance," the retired judge explained, tapping the paper. "The defendants are legally barred from contacting Adeline Sterling by any means. No phone calls, no emails, no physical proximity. A permanent protective order is enacted today. Any violation will result in immediate detention." I reached out and signed the document finalizing the boundaries. The legal triumph was definitive, grounded strictly in financial restitution and structural separation. I accepted this cold reality without shedding a single tear. The grieving daughter who wept in the Oregon mud at Sylvia's funeral was gone. In her place sat a resilient conservator who understood that some structures were too rotten to save. My parents built their lives on the currency of wealth and intimidation. I defeated them by mastering their native language and dismantling their empire brick by brick. The mediator closed the leather folder. "We are adjourned," he announced. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I did not offer a parting word to the people who brought me into the world. I turned my back on them and walked out of the glass-walled room, leaving Richard and Pamela sitting in the ruins of their own making. Harper walked beside me, her briefcase heavy with the signed victories. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor in a comfortable, victorious silence. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of the lobby and stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The winter sky was a bruised, heavy gray, and a cold Oregon rain was falling in steady, diagonal sheets. I lifted my face to the weather, feeling the icy drops hit my cheeks. The oppressive, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for the last 6 months vanished. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of the damp city air. I had successfully protected my grandmother's legacy. I had shielded the Willamette timberland from the logging machines. I secured my own financial future, relying strictly on my own professional expertise and grit. But as I stood in the rain, watching the headlights of passing cars reflect on the wet asphalt, a new realization settled over me. The liquid assets from the trust fund were sitting securely in my bank account. The offshore money was repatriated. I possessed a staggering amount of capital. Yet the physical heart of the history, the Victorian Queen Anne, where Sylvia raised me, still belonged to Elias Thorne. The developer held the deed to the rotting bones of the house. The legal war against my family was officially over, but my work as a historic restorer remained unfinished. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my cell phone to draft a new proposal, knowing exactly where I needed to direct my newly acquired wealth. The digital notification arrived on a Tuesday morning. The secure escrow accounts dispersed the recovered trust capital, funneling the staggering sum directly into my personal banking portfolio. For a long time, I sat in my small apartment, watching the cursor blink next to the sprawling string of zeros on my laptop screen. The stolen inheritance was finally secure. But possessing liquid wealth was never my ultimate objective. The funds were simply a mechanism, a heavy tool required to fix a structural defect in my history. I closed the computer, picked up my phone, and dialed the direct line for Elias Thorne. The out-of-state developer answered with a tired, strained greeting. The last 6 months had not been kind to his coastal investment strategy. When the local newspapers caught wind of the federal racketeering charges leveled against my parents, the negative press radiated outward, tainting every transaction they touched. The public scandal cast a dark shadow over the Astoria Victorian. Municipal zoning boards delayed his demolition permits, citing a need to review the historical integrity of the property. His private investors grew nervous about associating their capital with a highly publicized elder fraud case. Elias was holding a stalled asset he could not develop and could not afford to maintain. I arranged a meeting at a quiet coffee shop near the Columbia River to offer him an elegant exit strategy. Elias sat across from me in a worn leather booth, looking exhausted. The pragmatic businessman I met in the rain 6 months ago now appeared worn down by the endless bureaucratic red tape. I slid a standard commercial real estate contract across the table. I offered to buy the historic Queen Anne Victorian back from him at the exact fair market value. I did not ask for a discount, and I did not leverage his current precarious situation to force a bargain. I wanted the transaction recorded as a flawless, indisputable legal exchange, immune to any future scrutiny. Elias reviewed the numbers, his shoulders dropping in a profound display of relief. He signed the paperwork without a single moment of hesitation. He slid the plastic electronic keycard across the table, followed by the original heavy brass deadbolt my parents had stripped from the front door. I drove the familiar route to the coast, the Oregon sky transitioning from a bruised gray into a pale, clear blue. The salty ocean air whipped through the open windows of my truck, carrying the sharp scent of pine and tidal flats. I parked in front of the Victorian, stepping onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. The garish real estate sign was gone. The property sat quiet and dignified under the afternoon sun. I walked up the wooden steps of the wraparound porch, carrying my canvas tool bag and the heavy brass lock. Before I even stepped inside, I retrieved a screwdriver and systematically dismantled the blinking electronic keypad. I tossed the plastic components into my bag and reinstalled the antique deadbolt securing the heavy brass plate back into its rightful place. I inserted the metal key, feeling the satisfying solid click of the internal tumblers aligning. I pushed the heavy oak door open and crossed the threshold. I was the rightful owner. The profound emotional closure washed over me, heavy and warm, displacing the lingering chill of the long legal war. The foyer was empty, stripped of its antique Persian rugs and mahogany furniture, but the space no longer felt hollow or violated. The air inside smelled of aged cedar lemon oil and the faint, enduring memory of Sylvia. I walked through the parlor and the dining room, my boots echoing softly against the original hardwood floors. I ran my fingertips over the intricate wooden moldings, feeling the steady, enduring pulse of the architecture. The house had survived the betrayal, just as I had. I bypassed the main living areas and climbed the winding staircase, heading straight for the concealed door at the end of the second-floor hallway. I ascended the steep, creaking wooden steps leading to the third-floor attic. The dormer window let in a bright shaft of natural sunlight, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. I walked toward the center of the unfinished space, stopping in front of the exposed brick chimney breast. I knelt on the rough plank floorboards, examining the rectangular gap in the 1890s lath and plaster. This was the exact spot where the rusted tin box had rested for months, enveloped in horsehair insulation and decades of darkness. I reached out, tracing the jagged edges of the plaster where I had used my utility saw to cut away the wall. My grandmother spent her final days trapped in a state of quiet terror, yet she possessed the immense bravery to hide her truth inside these wooden bones. Looking at the empty cavity, a deep realization settled into my mind. True historical preservation was never just about saving old wood, polishing antique glass, or maintaining structural integrity. Preservation was about defending memory. It was about protecting the honest truth from people who wanted to pave over it with convenient lies. Sylvia saved the truth, and I used it to save us both. I stood up, wiping the white plaster dust from the knees of my denim work pants. The period of mourning was officially over. It was time to begin the actual work. Over the next several weeks, I transformed the empty Victorian into a rigorous, active restoration site. I refused to hire outside contractors, choosing to execute the meticulous labor entirely with my own hands. I wore my heavy canvas overalls every single day, waking up before dawn to mix traditional lime mortar in the backyard. I erected a small aluminum scaffold in the parlor to strip away the cheap modern paint my father had carelessly slapped over the original crown molding. The physical exertion was therapeutic, burning away the residual stress of the federal litigation. I spent hours carefully sanding the hardwood floors, bringing the rich, warm tone of the original Douglas fir back to the surface. I repaired the intricate spindle work on the wraparound porch, matching the precise architectural details crafted in 1894. I climbed onto the steep, pitched roof to replace the damaged fish scale shingles, securing the exterior shell against the harsh coastal storms. Every single nail I drove, every piece of trim I restored, felt like a deliberate act of devotion. I poured my expertise and my gratitude into the foundation, healing the scars left by my family. The house slowly breathed back to life. It transformed from a cold symbol of predatory betrayal into a stunning, vibrant monument dedicated to Sylvia. The restored Victorian stood as a physical testament to her quiet resilience and my ultimate triumph over the people who tried to erase us. I spent my evenings sitting on the front porch watching the coastal fog roll in from the Pacific Ocean, feeling a profound, unshakable peace. I had taken the broken, discarded pieces of my family greed and rebuilt something beautiful, permanent, and untouchable. Yet as I sat in the quiet evening air drinking a cup of hot black tea, my thoughts drifted away from the coast and traveled inland. The Astoria house was perfectly secure, standing strong on its stone foundation. But I held another embossed deed in my possession. 500 acres of ancient, towering timberland sat deep in the Willamette Valley. The pristine wilderness was registered in my name, safe from the immediate threat of logging machines and commercial developers. But ownership alone was not enough. Human lifetimes were fragile, and legal deeds could be contested by future generations of greedy relatives. If I truly wanted to honor my grandfather and protect the ecological sanctuary forever, I needed to construct a legal fortress far stronger than a simple property title. I set my ceramic mug down on the wooden porch railing, realizing the final, most important phase of my preservation work had just begun. Exactly 1 year later, I stood deep inside the towering canopy of the Willamette Valley. The air was remarkably cold, rich with the sharp scent of crushed pine needles, damp moss, and ancient earth. I rested my bare palm against the rough bark of a towering Douglas fir. The tree was easily 300 years old, its thick roots weaving a deep, intricate net into the fertile soil. The forest floor was quiet, insulated by a thick layer of green ferns and fallen autumn leaves. The only sound was the wind rushing through the upper branches, a steady oceanic roar that echoed across 500 acres of untouched wilderness. I took a deep breath, letting the clean Pacific Northwest air fill my lungs. This was the hidden asset my grandfather had purchased decades ago, the secret ecological sanctuary he tried so desperately to shield from his own son. If my father had succeeded in his frantic attempt to pay the delinquent property taxes, this pristine sanctuary would not exist today. Richard viewed the natural world as nothing more than a temporary obstacle standing in the way of a lucrative payday. He would have sold the deed to a commercial logging conglomerate within 24 hours of securing the title. The quiet rustle of the wind would have been replaced by the deafening roar of industrial chainsaws and heavy diesel machinery. These towering cedars would have been stripped from the earth, the fragile river ecosystem choked with thick mud, and the entire landscape reduced to a barren, profitable wasteland. He would have destroyed centuries of natural history just to maintain his superficial status in Portland high society. I did not sell the timber. Despite fielding numerous lucrative offers from ruthless logging developers wanting to harvest the old-growth wood, I refused to entertain a single commercial bid. Instead, I leveraged my professional background in historical conservation and hired a team of dedicated environmental attorneys. We spent the last 12 months navigating the complex framework of Oregon land preservation statutes. We transferred the private commercial deed into an irrevocable, state-protected historical land trust. I named it the Sylvia Heritage Trust. The legal charter is ironclad and perpetual. The land can never be subdivided, it can never be developed, and the trees can never be harvested for commercial profit. My parents wanted to destroy this majestic forest for quick cash, but my legal victory ensured it will remain permanently protected long after all of us are gone. The ultimate triumph over their greed was not just recovering the stolen funds. It was ensuring their destructive nature could never touch this sacred ground again. The financial restitution mandated by the federal mediation settlement stripped my parents of their stolen empire. Richard and Pamela were forced to vacate their pristine, sterile penthouse in the Pearl District. The luxury property was liquidated to repay the remaining debts owed to the original estate. They currently lease a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a nondescript concrete building on the far eastern edge of the city. The constant drone of highway traffic rattles their thin, single-pane windows, a harsh replacement for the soothing classical string quartets they used to hire. The wealthy investors and influential politicians who once attended their lavish galas severed all ties. In the elite circles of high society, Financial fraud is the unforgivable sin. My parents are socially exiled, confined to a modest living space with low ceilings and cheap linoleum floors, forced to spend their twilight years facing the hollow, empty reality of a life built on deception. They have no country club memberships, no imported champagne, and no audience left to impress. My sister experienced an equally harsh descent into reality. Following her personal bankruptcy and the repossession of her luxury vehicle, Vanessa was forced to seek actual employment to survive. Without our parents to secretly fund her vanity projects, her lack of practical skills became a glaring liability. She currently works a minimum wage retail job at a high-end clothing boutique in downtown Portland. She spends 40 hours a week standing on her aching feet, steaming silk blouses and folding cashmere sweaters for the exact same wealthy socialites she used to consider her peers. The people she once gossiped with now hand her their platinum credit cards without bothering to look her in the eye. She traded a stolen luxury lifestyle for the daily grinding humiliation of serving the world that expelled her, learning the true cost of hard work, one agonizing retail shift at a time. If you are listening to this story right now, if you have ever been the quiet one in your family, I want you to understand something crucial. Greedy, materialistic people operate under a very specific, dangerous delusion. They mistake a quiet demeanor for inherent weakness. They view your empathy, your patience, and your willingness to forgive as vulnerabilities they can easily exploit. My family assumed that because I preferred the solitary work of restoring old houses over attending flashy parties, I lacked the spine to defend myself. They thought they could sell my grandmother's home behind my back, steal my inheritance, and dismiss my grief with a casual wave of their hand. They believed I would just lower my head and accept the injustice to keep the peace. They were wrong. You do not have to accept the role they assign to you. You do not have to remain the silent, accommodating victim in a narrative written by selfish people. Knowing your own worth is the most lethal weapon you can wield against a toxic family. Once you strip away the desperate need for their approval, their power over you evaporates into thin air. You do not need to tolerate disrespect just because you share a biological connection. Blood might make you related, but loyalty, honesty, and mutual respect are what actually build a family. I learned how to stand my ground, how to gather the facts, and how to strike back using the undeniable weight of the documented truth. I stopped trying to earn their conditional love and focused entirely on protecting the legacy of the one person who actually gave it to me freely. I left the Willamette timberland as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the forest floor. I drove my truck back to the coast, arriving in Astoria just as the evening fog rolled in off the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean. I parked on the street and walked up the front steps of the restored Queen Anne Victorian. The exterior paint was fresh, the original fish scale shingles were perfectly aligned, and the intricate spindlework on the wraparound porch was flawless. I had spent the last year bringing the architecture back from the brink of decay, pouring my grief and my triumph into every single wooden joint. I stepped inside the foyer, turning on the warm vintage glass lamps. The house did not feel empty anymore. It felt vibrant, grounded, and intensely alive. I walked through the parlor, admiring the restored hardwood floors and the smooth plaster walls. I had successfully repaired the damage, both physical and generational. I walked back to the front door, standing on the threshold. I reached out and pulled the heavy oak door shut. I inserted my brass key into the antique deadbolt. The metal tumblers aligned with a sharp, heavy, and deeply satisfying click. I stood in the quiet hallway of my own home, surrounded by preserved history, profound wealth, and the quiet, enduring peace that comes from surviving the fire and finally owning the ground you stand on. We spend our lives building. We build careers, we build financial portfolios, and above all, we attempt to build families. But watching the collapse of the Sterling dynasty in the story of Adeline and her grandmother Sylvia, we are reminded of an ancient, quiet truth. often drowned out by the deafening noise of modern ambition. A house erected on a rotting foundation will eventually collapse and crush everyone dwelling inside it. This narrative is not merely a tale of stolen deeds and recovered wealth. It is a profound reflection on the architecture of the human soul and the tragic consequences of a society that worships the facade while allowing the foundation to decay. In contemporary American culture, the concept of legacy has become dangerously distorted. We frequently observe parents like Richard and Pamela who measure the success of their parenting by the square footage of their penthouses, the prestige of their zip codes, and the luxury vehicles parked in their driveways. They represent a severe spiritual sickness that currently infects many modern families. The misguided belief that material accumulation can somehow substitute for moral instruction and emotional presence. Traditional family values are not found in projecting a flawless, aristocratic image on a holiday greeting card. True family structure is rooted in unwavering honesty, fairness, and the sacred, difficult duty to nurture a child's character, rather than just their trust fund. Through this story, the message for parents is an urgent call for deep introspection. When parents practice toxic favoritism, showering a child like Vanessa with unearned luxuries while marginalizing and exploiting the quiet, hardworking child like Adeline, they are not providing a head start in life. They are handing their favored child a cup of poison disguised as fine wine, raising adults who are entirely unequipped to face the realities of the world without a financial safety net. True family responsibility requires parents to cultivate profound emotional awareness. It demands that they look at their children not as extensions of their own fragile egos, nor as tools for social climbing, but as independent spirits entrusted to their care. Raising a resilient child requires demonstrating integrity in the dark when no society photographer is there to document it. From the perspective of a spiritual seeker, one who walks the path of self-cultivation and observes the currents of our societal reality, the diagnosis is stark. We live in an era of profound spiritual poverty, dressed up in designer clothing. Society has traded the hard, quiet work of self-correction for the loud, hollow pursuit of instant gratification. The Sterling parents were incredibly wealthy in the material realm, yet entirely bankrupt in the spiritual one. They stole from a dying widow because their internal voids were so vast that no amount of offshore capital could ever fill them. True wisdom teaches us that to heal our society, we must first relentlessly correct ourselves. We must cultivate the 3 essential pillars of a meaningful existence: wisdom to see through deception, morality to guide our actions, and the willpower to endure hardships without losing our humanity. For the younger generation, Adeline's journey serves as a brilliant blueprint for this exact type of practical and spiritual cultivation. Young people today are frequently burdened by the generational trauma, toxic expectations, and moral compromises passed down to them by their elders. The message here is profoundly liberating. You are not bound by the sins of your lineage. Adeline teaches us that true empowerment is generated entirely from within. She utilized her wisdom to see through her parents' elaborate gaslighting, her morality to protect her grandmother's legacy and a pristine natural ecosystem, and her immense resilience to endure the agonizing pain of betrayal without allowing it to turn her into a bitter, vengeful monster. She did not seek the spotlight. She did the quiet, unglamorous, solitary work in the shadows, methodically scraping away the cheap paint of her family's lies to reveal the original, durable truth beneath. She proved that you do not need to scream to be heard, and you do not need to mimic the cruelty of your abusers to defeat them. You simply need to stand firmly in your own undeniable worth, cultivate your intellect, and let the truth act as your heaviest weapon. Life is a constant process of restoration. It asks us to examine the structures of our own lives, our relationships, our ambitions, our moral boundaries, and ask if they can withstand the inevitable storms of truth. If you find yourself resonating with these quiet struggles, if you have ever felt invisible in your own home, or if you have ever had to dismantle a broken system to protect your own peace, you are not alone in this work. I encourage you to follow Morning Revenge, where we continue to explore these deep, often unspoken narratives of justice, healing, and the courageous reclamation of self. We are heavily conditioned by traditional American society to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond, that the family unit must be preserved at all costs, and that unconditional forgiveness is a mandatory requirement for spiritual peace. We are instructed to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, and to respect our elders simply because they hold the biological title of a parent. But there is a deeper, more demanding philosophical truth that runs directly counter to this conventional comfort. Sometimes the highest expression of morality is not forgiveness. It is the establishment of an impenetrable boundary. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer your lineage is to become the absolute end of its toxic cycles. You do not owe your compliance to a family structure that requires you to shrink, to lie, or to suffer in silence just to maintain an illusion for the neighbors. True spiritual enlightenment does not demand that you sit peacefully inside a burning house while your family strikes the matches. It demands that you possess the wisdom to see the fire, the willpower to walk out the front door, and the moral courage to lock it firmly behind you, leaving the architects of the flames to inhabit the ruins of their own making.